The man was already on his feet when the shout cut through the cabin. "Sir, sit down." The command wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the weight of authority, borrowed, not earned. A voice trained to be obeyed. The aisle froze. A suitcase tipped sideways in an overhead bin. Somewhere behind row 3, a baby began to cry, thin and startled. Ethan Cole stood still, one hand braced on the seat back, the other holding a slim leather folder against his chest like a shield. His breathing stayed even, slow in, slow out. The kind of control learned the hard way over years, in rooms where a single wrong word could cost millions. The flight attendant didn't see that. She saw a tall black man, standing in first class before the door had closed. She saw disruption. She saw risk. "This aircraft will not depart until you're seated," she said. Eyes locked on him. Chin lifted. Ethan glanced down the aisle. Faces stared back. Some curious, some irritated. A few already decided he was the problem. He felt it in the way their eyes slid past his face, searching for reassurance from the uniform instead. "I am seated," he said calmly. "Seat 2A." The attendant's lips pressed into a line. She looked at her tablet, then at him, then past him as if expecting someone else to step forward and confirm he belonged. Behind her, a woman shifted impatiently in her seat. White, late 50s, perfect posture, perfect hair. The kind of woman who wore confidence like perfume, strong enough to fill a room before she spoke. "Unbelievable," the woman muttered just loud enough. Every time, Ethan heard it. He always did. The attendant inhaled slow and deliberate, the way people do when they're about to assert control. "Sir, I need you to take your seat immediately. You're blocking the aisle." "I stood because you told me to stow my bag," Ethan replied, voice steady. "You also told me to wait." Her eyes flicked to the carry-on already locked in the bin above his seat. A harmless rectangle. Nothing out of place. Nothing worth this. The captain's voice chimed faintly from the cockpit. "Boarding complete in first class. Prepare for door closure." The tension sharpened. Time pressure. The unspoken threat that delays had consequences, and someone would pay for them. The woman in 2C leaned forward now, craning to see past the attendant. Her gaze skimmed Ethan's suit, his shoes the folder in his hand. Calculating. Measuring. "Is there a problem?" she asked. Voice smooth, practiced. Not concern. Ownership. The attendant didn't answer her. She kept her focus on Ethan. "Sir, if you don't comply, I will have to escalate this." Escalate. The word landed heavy. It always did. Ethan felt the familiar tightening behind his ribs. Not fear. Something colder. A memory of rooms where escalation meant security, not conversation. He lowered himself into his seat without breaking eye contact. The leather sighed beneath him. A concession, not surrender. The folder rested on his lap. "There," he said quietly. The attendant nodded once, sharp and satisfied, and stepped back. The aisle breathed again. Conversations resumed in hushed fragments. The baby stopped crying. But the moment didn't pass. It settled, like dust. The woman in 2C turned fully now, angling her body toward Ethan. She smiled, thin and polite, the kind that never reached the eyes. "You know," she said, "this flight is usually very smooth, as long as everyone follows the rules." Ethan met her gaze. Her eyes were pale and unblinking, assessing, looking for a reaction. "I find that rules work best," he said, "when they're applied evenly." Her smile stiffened. A flicker passed through her expression. Surprise, maybe. Or irritation that he hadn't taken the hint to stay silent. She leaned back with a small huff crossing her legs. The movement was precise, controlled, like a line drawn. Across the aisle, an older man watched everything over the rim of his glasses. 70s. Grey hair cropped short, hands folded neatly over a newspaper he wasn't reading. His eyes lingered on Ethan for a beat longer than polite. Not hostile, curious, measuring in a different way. The door thumped shut. The aircraft shuddered as ground power disconnected. The familiar low hum of systems shifting filled the cabin. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second. The vibration traveled up through the seat into his spine. A reminder that once airborne, there was no stepping away. No exit. Everything that happened next would happen here. Together. He opened his eyes to the window. Rain streaked the glass, thin lines cutting the grey afternoon light. Chicago in late fall. Cold and unforgiving. The woman beside him let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "I swear," she said, "to no one in particular. They'll sell first class to anyone these days." A couple of passengers chuckled softly. Agreement without commitment. The kind that dissolved the moment responsibility appeared. Ethan didn't turn. His jaw tightened. He felt the folder on his lap heavier than paper should be. Inside were documents marked confidential. Drafts, affidavits, a timeline that didn't forgive mistakes. He had spent the morning in a glass conference room, overlooking the river, listening to men in tailored suits explain why corners had been cut, why warnings had been ignored, why accountability could wait until next quarter. He had said very little. He usually did. Silence made people careless. The woman shifted again, the faint clink of ice in her glass breaking the steady hum of the cabin. She had ordered early. A privilege exercised without thought. "Excuse me," she called to the attendant as she passed. "Another one of these, please." "And can you make it strong?" The attendant smiled instantly. "Of course, ma'am." Ethan watched the exchange from the corner of his eye. The ease, the warmth, the way tension evaporated when the right person spoke. The older man across the aisle cleared his throat. "We're all just trying to get somewhere," he said, mildly folding his paper at last. "No need to make it harder than it is." The woman glanced at him surprised, then waved a dismissive hand. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." The engine spooled louder. The plane began to roll. The city slid past the window in slow, indifferent motion. Ethan adjusted the folder on his lap, aligning its edges with the armrest. Control in small things. He felt the weight of what was coming not as a threat, but as a certainty. He wasn't supposed to be noticed today. He was supposed to arrive quietly, review files in a quiet hotel room, attend meetings where other people would speak too much and reveal more than they intended. But something had shifted. A hairline fracture in the surface of normalcy. A pressure point pressed too hard. As the plane turned toward the runway, the woman beside him lifted her glass, the red liquid catching the dim cabin light. She gestured with it as she spoke again, careless, expansive. "Honestly," she said, "some people don't know how to behave in spaces they didn't earn." Ethan felt the words land. He felt the eyes, the judgment settling like a verdict already decided. The aircraft paused at the threshold, engines roaring now, a moment of stillness before acceleration. Ethan looked straight ahead, face unreadable. Inside, the tempo was rising. Not anger. Purpose. The quiet kind that didn't need permission. High above the tarmac, legal servers were already syncing across time zones, draft orders waiting for a final trigger. Processes older than any one person built for moments exactly like this. The plane surged forward, pressing everyone back into their seats. Glasses rattled. The woman laughed, gripping her armrest, the drink sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Ethan didn't look at her. He watched the horizon tilt, the ground fall away. Somewhere between the roar of the engines and the thin line of sky opening ahead, a line had been crossed. And before this flight touched down again, far more than altitude would change. The turbulence came without warning, a hard jolt that snapped conversations mid-sentence and sent a sharp ripple through the cabin. The seatbelt sign chimed on urgent and metallic. Glasses clinked. Somewhere behind them, a nervous laugh broke and died. The woman in 2C gasped as her arm jerked. Red wine surged up the bowl of her glass, cresting dangerously close to the rim. She tightened her grip knuckles, whitening, then laughed again, too loud. "Jesus," she said. "This flight's already a mess." Ethan felt the jolt travel through his seat and settle low in his back. He kept his eyes forward. His breath stayed slow. The kind of turbulence you don't fight. You ride it out. The attendant moved briskly down the aisle, voice calm but clipped. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Her eyes slid to Ethan for half a beat longer than necessary, then away. The older man across the aisle shifted, bracing his feet, newspaper sliding to the floor. He glanced at Ethan, then at the woman beside him, as if mapping the space between them. "You okay?" he asked Ethan quietly. Ethan nodded once. "All good." The woman in 2C rolled her eyes. Some of us didn't sign up for a roller coaster. She lifted her glass again, despite the light still glowing overhead. "Relax. I fly all the time." The attendant stopped beside her. "Ma'am, I need you to put that down until the sign is off." The woman smiled, indulgent. "It's just a sip." Before the attendant could respond, the plane lurched again, sharper this time. Not enough to throw anyone from their seat, but enough to turn confidence into surprise. The wine leapt. It happened fast. Too fast for apology. The glass tipped the liquid, arcing out in a dark splash that struck Ethan square in the chest. It soaked through his shirt, bled into the folder on his lap, spattered the armrest, and pooled on the floor by his shoes. The cabin inhaled as one. "Oh," the woman said, breathless hand flying to her mouth. Then almost immediately her expression hardened. "You moved." Ethan looked down at the spreading stain. The cold seeped through fabric sharp against his skin. He felt the weight of the folder grow as paper absorbed liquid. His jaw tightened. He did not jump up. He did not shout. He placed the folder carefully on the adjacent seat, keeping it level, protecting what he could. "I did not," he said. His voice was low even. The attendant rushed forward, towels already in hand. "Sir, I'm so sorry." She reached toward him, then hesitated, glancing at the woman. The woman waved a dismissive hand. It was an accident. He was blocking the aisle earlier. "I lost my balance." She looked down at her own skirt, inspecting a single dark drop near the hem. "This is silk." Ethan felt heat rise behind his eyes. Not anger, but clarity. A line drawn clean. "Ma'am," he said, lifting his gaze to meet hers. "You were told to put the glass down." Her eyes flashed. "Excuse me." The older man across the aisle leaned forward. "I saw it," he said, voice steady. "The sign was on." She snapped her head toward him. "Mind your business." The attendant swallowed. "Ma'am, I need to document this." "Document what the woman shot back. Turbulence." She laughed sharply. "Or him intimidating me." The word hung there, ugly and deliberate. Ethan stood slowly, careful not to drip onto anyone else. He towered over the woman without trying to. His presence filled the narrow space, not aggressive, just undeniable. "I am requesting that this incident be logged," he said to the attendant, "and that the captain be informed." The woman scoffed. "You can't be serious." "I am," Ethan said. The attendant nodded relief, flickering across her face at the clarity of the request. She turned and hurried toward the galley. The woman's laugh faded. "Do you have any idea who you're making trouble for?" she asked, lowering her voice. "My husband is flying to London to fix a mess your people created." Ethan paused. "Your people?" She leaned closer, wine-scented breath sharp. "Lawyers," she said. "Always circling when there's blood." Across the aisle, the older man exhaled slowly, a sound of quiet disbelief. Ethan took his seat again, careful, controlled. He pulled a clean handkerchief from his jacket pocket and dabbed at the stain, though he knew it was too late. The shirt would never be the same. Some things didn't wash out. Minutes passed. The cabin settled into a brittle quiet. The engines hummed steady now. Outside the window, cloud swallowed the sky thick and grey. The attendant returned with the purser, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a practiced calm. He listened as Ethan spoke, nodding, making notes. He listened again as the woman interrupted, voice rising, gestures sharp. He did not interrupt either of them. "We'll file a report," the purser said at last, "and I'll inform the captain." The woman crossed her arms. "This is ridiculous." The purser met her gaze. "Ma'am, please lower your voice." Something shifted then. The balance she was used to tipped just enough to be noticed. She leaned back, lips pressed tight, eyes darting around the cabin, as if searching for allies. Most looked away. A few stared openly. None stepped in. The older man picked up his newspaper at last, smoothing it carefully. His hands were steady. Ethan felt the damp fabric cling to his skin. He reached into the folder, pulling out what pages he could salvage, laying them flat on the empty seat to dry. Ink had run, but not beyond recognition. The essential parts remained. He took out his phone screen, glowing softly. No frantic typing, just a single message, composed with care, sent to a secure address. An update, a timestamp, a note that would slide into an existing file like a final piece clicking into place. The woman watched him now, suspicion sharpening her features. "Who are you texting?" she demanded. Ethan did not look up. "People who need to know," he said. Her laugh came out thin. "You think you have power here?" Ethan lifted his eyes, then meeting hers fully. "I think actions have consequences," he said. "Even at 35,000 feet. She stared at him, searching for something to push against. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, edged with something like uncertainty. "You're enjoying this?" Ethan shook his head once. "No." The seatbelt sign chimed off. The cabin exhaled again, movement resuming in cautious increments. But the air had changed, charged, expectant. Somewhere deep in the aircraft systems, updated logs synchronized. In an office thousands of miles away, an alert appeared on a screen, flagged not as urgent but as important. Enough to pause a meeting, enough to ask a question that had been ignored once too often. Ethan leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. He felt the plane steady beneath him, felt the stain cool and dry. He knew the shape of what was coming, not in detail, but in direction. The woman beside him took a long breath, lifting her glass again slower this time. Her hand shook just enough to notice. She set it down untouched. Outside, the clouds thinned, a pale band of light breaking through. The flight pressed on, unaware of how much weight it was carrying now, not in cargo, but in consequence. By the time dinner service began, the cabin had learned a new rhythm, one built around avoidance. Trays slid out with muted clicks. Cutlery chimed softly against porcelain. Voices dropped to whispers that died the moment they drifted too close to row 2. Ethan sat still, jacket folded beside him, shirt stiff where the wine had dried. The stain had darkened, spreading like a map no one wanted to read. He stared past the window at nothing mind working through layers that never showed on his face. The woman in 2C watched him from the corner of her eye. She hadn't touched her drink. The ice had melted into a cloudy puddle, untouched proof of restraint she didn't know she possessed until now. Every few minutes, she shifted, straightening her posture, smoothing her skirt, reclaiming control in small, rehearsed gestures. Across the aisle, the older man ate slowly, methodical chewing longer than necessary. He kept glancing between them, not hiding it anymore. He had lived long enough to recognize the moment when a room quietly chooses sides. The attendant returned with a fresh shirt, sealed in plastic, held out like a peace offering. "Compliments of the airline," she said, eyes flicking nervously toward the woman. "If you'd like to change." Ethan accepted it with a nod. "Thank you." He stood and followed her toward the lavatory at the front of the cabin. The narrow space amplified every sound, every breath. He peeled off the stained shirt, folded it carefully, and slipped into the clean one. The fabric was crisp, impersonal. It did not belong to him. As he washed his hands, he caught his reflection. Calm face, steady eyes. A man who looked unbothered. He knew better. The pressure sat behind his sternum, patient waiting. When he returned, the woman's gaze snapped to him, taking in the fresh shirt, the absence of visible damage. Her jaw tightened. Something about his composure unsettled her, more than anger would have. "You clean up fast," she said, attempting lightness. Ethan did not respond. He opened his tray, ate without haste, each movement deliberate. The sound of his fork against the plate seemed louder than it should have been. Halfway through the meal, The purser reappeared, leaning slightly toward Ethan. "The captain would like a word when it's convenient." The woman froze. Her fork hovered mid-air. About what she asked sharply. The purser's eyes did not leave Ethan. "Procedure," he said. Ethan dabbed his mouth, rose again and followed him forward. The cockpit door closed behind them with a dull thud. The captain listened in silence as Ethan spoke. He did not interrupt. His hands rested flat on the console fingers, Splade grounding himself. When Ethan finished, the captain exhaled slowly. "We've had complaints before," he said. "Nothing formal. Nothing like this." Ethan nodded. "Patterns rarely announce themselves," he said. The captain studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "I'll make a note. We'll do what we can." When Ethan returned to his seat, the woman's composure cracked just enough to show teeth. "What did you say to him?" she demanded in a whisper. "The truth," Ethan replied. She leaned back, crossing her arms. "You think this gives you leverage?" Ethan met her eyes. "No," he said. "It gives me a record." The words landed harder than any insult. She looked away, jaw clenched, as if bracing against something she couldn't yet see. Minutes stretched. Hours passed. Night settled fully outside the window, reflecting their faces back at them, doubled and distorted. Somewhere over the Atlantic, Ethan's phone vibrated softly. Once. Then again. He glanced down. Messages short and precise, stacking in sequence. A confirmation. A request for clarification. A final acknowledgement that carried more weight than any threat. He typed a brief reply. Sent it. Slid the phone back into his pocket. The woman watched his hands. "You're enjoying this," she said again, quieter now. Ethan shook his head. "I'm finishing something that started long before this flight." She laughed, brittle. "You're a lawyer. You people live for this." Ethan turned toward her, fully now. His voice dropped measured. "I live for accountability." Across the aisle, the older man cleared his throat. "For what it's worth," he said, eyes on the woman. "Some of us saw exactly what happened." She stared at him, disbelief flashing across her face. "You're taking his side." The man folded his napkin. "I'm taking the side of decency." Her mouth opened, then closed. No retort came. The silence stretched heavy and unmistakable. Sleep came fitfully to the cabin. Lights dimmed. Bodies shifted. The woman pretended to rest, eyes closed, hands clenched beneath the blanket. Her mind raced, replaying the moment of the spill, the way his voice had never risen, the way the room had turned against her, without a word being spoken. Ethan did not sleep. He watched the faint glow of the wingtip light pulse against the dark, a steady heartbeat in the void. He thought of meetings yet to come, of rooms where his presence would be felt long before he spoke. He thought of how easily people mistook restraint for weakness. Hours later, the captain's voice filled the cabin, calm and formal, announcing their descent. London in the morning. Grey skies, light rain. Please remain seated until we reach the gate. The woman sat up, smoothing her hair, reclaiming armor. She reached for her phone, scrolling through messages, then frowned when the screen lagged. She tried again. Nothing. Across the aisle, the older man watched her with quiet concern. "Signal can be spotty," he offered. She forced a smile. I'm sure it's nothing. Ethan felt the plane angle downward, pressure shifting in his ears. His phone vibrated again. One message this time, short, definitive. He read it once, then closed his eyes, briefly absorbing the weight of it. The aircraft broke through the clouds. London spread beneath them, wet and sprawling, indifferent to individual dramas. The runway lights flared, guiding them home. The woman glanced at Ethan, something like fear flickering across her face now. "We're landing," she said as if reminding herself. "This ends when we get off." Ethan looked at her, not unkindly. "No," he said. "That's when it begins." The wheels touched down with a jolt that rattled the cabin. Applause rippled weakly from the back. The plane slowed, taxiing toward the terminal. Then it stopped. Minutes passed. No gate. No movement. The engines idled. The seatbelt sign remained lit. A murmur spread. Confusion. Impatience. The captain's voice returned lower, now controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked to hold position. Please remain seated." The woman's phone buzzed at last. She glanced down, color draining from her face as she read. Her fingers trembled. She looked up at Ethan, eyes wide. "What did you do?" she whispered. Ethan did not answer. He stared ahead as flashing blue lights reflected faintly against the cabin walls, growing brighter with each passing second. The first knock on the aircraft door sounded nothing like an invitation. It was firm, deliberate metal against metal, a sound that cut through the low murmur of confusion and settled into the bones. Conversations died. Screens dimmed. Even the engines seemed to hush as if the plane itself were listening. The forward door opened a fraction cold air, pushing into the cabin. A voice spoke quietly to the purser, then louder, carrying authority that didn't ask to be questioned. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, rain darkening the shoulders of their jackets, shoes squeaking softly on the carpet as they moved forward. The woman in 2C straightened, chin, lifting relief flickering across her face like a candle catching. She leaned toward the aisle, already preparing the story she had rehearsed in her head during descent. She imagined sympathy. She imagined control returning to its rightful place. Ethan did not move. The older man across the aisle removed his glasses, folded them carefully and set them on his newspaper. His eyes were sharp now, attentive the way they might have been decades earlier, when consequences mattered and people were still expected to answer for themselves. The lead officer stopped beside Ethan's row. He glanced down at a tablet, then up at Ethan. "Mr. Cole," he said, pronunciation, careful, respectful. "We'll need a brief statement. Are you injured?" "No," Ethan replied. "But my property was damaged, and there are witnesses." The officer nodded. "Understood." He turned, pivoting with measured precision, and faced the woman in 2C. Her smile faltered. Finally, she said, breathless, "This man has been threatening me since takeoff." The officer did not respond. He read from the tablet. "Ma'am, please remain seated." Her eyes widened. "Excuse me." The second officer stepped closer, presence closing in like a door. "We need to ask you a few questions." She laughed, short and incredulous. "This is absurd. My husband is meeting people in the terminal right now. You can't hold me here." The lead officer's gaze remained steady. "Ma'am, this is not a request." A ripple of sound moved through the cabin. Phones appeared in hands raised just enough to record without being obvious. The attendant stood frozen near the galley knuckles, white against the counter edge. Ethan felt the plane's stillness deepen. This was the moment where stories collapsed or hardened into lies. He knew the shape of it. He had seen it in courtrooms, in depositions, in the seconds before a witness decided whether to tell the truth. The woman's voice sharpened. He spilled wine on himself and blamed me. You saw the turbulence. The older man cleared his throat. No, he said quietly. We didn't. Every head turned. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. The officer looked at him. Sir. The man straightened in his seat. I saw her lift the glass after the sign was on. I saw it tip. There was no accident. The woman stared at him. Betrayal etched across her face. You can't be serious. I am, he said. And I heard what you said afterward. The officer nodded once, then gestured to the attendant. Ma'am, do you have a report? The attendant swallowed, then stepped forward, holding the tablet with both hands like a lifeline. Yes, she said. Her voice steadied as she spoke. The incident was logged. I also informed the captain. We have audio from the cabin intercom during the exchange. The woman's confidence cracked. Just a hairline fracture. Enough. This is ridiculous, she said, standing abruptly. The movement was sudden, defiant. I am an American citizen. So am I. The officer replied calmly. Please sit down. She did not. The second officer moved fast, hand on her wrist, guiding her back into the seat with practiced efficiency. The woman gasped, the sound sharp and shocked, as if no one had ever dared to touch her without permission. You can't do this, she said, voice trembling now. My husband will. The lead officer held up a hand. Ma'am, you are being detained on suspicion of assault and interference with flight safety. You will have an opportunity to make a statement. The words landed like a verdict. The woman's mouth opened, then closed. Color drained from her face, leaving her eyes too bright, too exposed. Across the aisle, the older man watched her with something like sorrow. Not pity. Recognition. Ethan remained seated, hands folded loosely in his lap. He felt no triumph, only a quiet settling the way a long argument finally ends. The officers turned back to him. Mr. Cole, the lead officer, said, We'll escort you off first. The woman lunged forward, then desperation breaking through restraint. You did this, she hissed. You set this up. Ethan met her gaze, voice low enough that only she could hear. You set it in motion. As he stood, the cabin shifted again. Bodies leaning, eyes tracking him. The attendant stepped aside, offering a small, grateful nod. Ethan returned it just as small. He walked toward the door, past the officers, past the rain-streaked threshold, and into the cold morning air. The smell of jet fuel and wet concrete hit him sharp and real. He paused only long enough to breathe it in. Behind him, the woman's protests rose, then faded, swallowed by procedure. In the terminal, fluorescent lights hummed. Security personnel waited with quiet efficiency. Ethan gave his statement concise, factual, leaving nothing out and adding nothing unnecessary. He handed over the damaged documents, the shirt sealed in a clear bag, evidence catalogued with care. Through the glass he saw the woman led away, shoulders hunched, now hair disheveled, the armor of composure stripped clean. Cameras flashed somewhere beyond the barrier. She flinched, unprepared for being seen like this. Ethan turned away. His phone buzzed. A message from the same secure thread. Confirmation received. Order acknowledged. The words were simple. The implication was not. He stepped into the arrivals hall where travelers surged and parted lives intersecting without touching. Somewhere to his left, raised voices echoed briefly, then cut off. Somewhere to his right, laughter spilled from a coffee kiosk. Ethan moved through it all unnoticed again, the way he preferred. Outside, rain fell steady and thin. A car idled at the curb. He opened the door and slid inside, warmth enveloping him, glass muting the world. As the vehicle pulled away, he allowed himself one glance back at the terminal, at the place where assumptions had collided with consequence. This was never about a glass of wine. It never was. It was about what people believed they could get away with, and what happened when they were finally told they could not. By the time the car reached the perimeter road, the rain had turned heavier, streaking sideways across the windshield, like something trying to erase what had just happened. Ethan leaned back, hands folded, listening to the muted rhythm of traffic and the steady breathing of the driver who did not speak unless spoken to. His phone rested face down on his thigh. He did not look at it. He already knew what it would say. Inside the terminal, the woman's world was unraveling one controlled step at a time. She sat in a narrow interview room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old coffee wrists, bare but marked with faint red lines where hands had been placed without asking. A constable spoke calmly, professionally, as if this were an ordinary morning. Questions were asked. Answers were expected. Her voice shook when she tried to maintain indignation. It cracked completely when the questions stopped and the waiting began. Across the airport, in a quieter corridor, marked staff only her husband paced. Richard Cole had arrived before dawn, jet-lagged, and wired tie-loosened phone glued to his ear until there was no one left willing to answer. He had expected inconvenience, delays, perhaps a discreet conversation. He had not expected silence, the kind that meant systems were moving without him. He stopped walking when a man in a dark suit approached, flanked by two others carrying slim cases. No raised voices, no dramatic gestures, just papers held out with polite finality. "Mr. Cole," the man said, "we need to inform you of a temporary preservation order, effective immediately." Richard stared at the words, reading them once, twice, as if repetition would change their meaning. "This has to be a mistake." "It is not," the man replied. "You will have an opportunity to contest." Richard's phone vibrated then. He answered without looking. "Where are you?" his wife demanded, panic stripped bare of pretense. He closed his eyes. "Not now. You need to fix this," she said. "They're holding me." "I can't," he said, and hated the sound of it, even as it left his mouth. Back in the car, Ethan finally turned his phone over. Messages stacked neatly, each a brick laid into place. Confirmation of receipt, notice of compliance, a single line that read simply, "Order entered prior to landing." He closed his eyes for a moment, not in relief, but in acknowledgement. This was the part people never saw. The quiet machinery, doing what it was built to do. The driver glanced at him in the mirror. "Hotel, yes," Ethan said. "But take the long way." The city slid by in grey layers. Stone and glass and history pressed together. Ethan watched it without really seeing mind already, several steps ahead, mapping conversations yet to come. He thought of the woman's face when the officers had turned toward her. The shock, the disbelief. He thought of how often that moment arrived too late. At the same time, in a holding room with no windows, she stared at her reflection in a stainless steel panel. The woman looking back did not recognize her. Hair out of place, makeup smudged, confidence gone. She replayed the flight over and over, searching for the point where she could have turned back. There was none. Not one she would have chosen. An officer opened the door. "You'll be released shortly," he said. "Pending further proceedings." "Am I charged?" she asked. "Not yet," he said. "But there will be a hearing." Her phone was returned. It felt heavier than before. She scrolled through messages she could not read fast enough. Bank alerts she did not understand, missed calls from numbers she recognized, and some she did not. Her breath came shallow, sharp. Ethan checked into the hotel without incident. The lobby was warm, hushed, the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to go wrong. He took the key, thanked the clerk, rode the elevator alone. When the doors closed, he allowed his shoulders to drop a fraction. Not exhaustion. Focus. In his room, he laid the folder on the desk, spreading the damp pages, carefully weighing them down with a glass. He opened his laptop, secure connection already waiting. He read through the messages again, slower this time. Somewhere between the lines, a larger story was taking shape, one that would not be contained by a single flight or a single incident. Across town, Richard sat in a rented office, head in his hands. Advisors spoke around him, voices blending into a low hum. Words like exposure and oversight and timing floated past, detached from meaning. He kept seeing the same image, his wife lifting the glass, the red arc frozen in mid-air. A small thing, a catastrophic one. He looked up suddenly. "Who is he?" No one answered right away. Then carefully, "A senior partner," someone said. "He specializes in risk." Richard laughed, a short, broken sound. "Of course he does." The city moved on. News tickers updated quietly. A delayed flight. An incident resolved. Nothing yet worth mentioning. Not yet. In his hotel room, Ethan typed one last message before shutting the laptop. He stood at the window watching headlights trace wet streets below. He felt no satisfaction. Only the steady pull of what came next. Somewhere between the airport and the river, the woman stared out of the back of a taxi, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The city did not look at her. It never had. Ethan turned from the window and reached for the light. Tomorrow would be louder. Today had done its work. Morning arrived without ceremony. Grey light pressed through the hotel curtains, dull and persistent, the kind that made time feel heavier than it was. Ethan woke before the alarm, already alert mind, moving ahead of his body. He lay still for a moment, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the muted clink of glassware being set somewhere below. London was awake. So was the machinery he had set in motion. Across the city, the woman sat at a small kitchen table she did not recognize as hers. A borrowed apartment. A friend who had answered the phone out of obligation, not loyalty. Her coat hung over the back of a chair, stained at the cuff, where red wine had dried into a dark bruise. She stared at it as if it were evidence of a crime she still could not fully grasp. Her phone lay on the table screen, dark silent in a way that felt deliberate. She picked it up and checked again. Bank app. Still locked. Credit card. Declined. The words swam. She pressed her fingers into her temples, trying to slow the pounding behind her eyes. This wasn't how consequences were supposed to work. They were meant to be negotiable. Explained away. Managed. Ethan dressed methodically. Shirt, jacket, tie adjusted just enough to be correct, not impressive. He reviewed notes while the coffee cooled untouched. Messages continued to arrive, but fewer now. The frantic stage had passed. What remained was execution. In a glass-walled conference room overlooking the river, a group of men and women gathered around a polished table. No one raised their voice. No one wasted time. Ethan joined them without preamble, nodding once as he took his seat. He listened as reports were delivered. Timelines confirmed, options narrowed. The order stands, someone said. Jurisdiction is clear. Ethan nodded. Proceed. At the same hour, the woman finally reached her husband. He answered on the third ring, voice flat. I'm in a meeting. You have to help me, she said, words tumbling over each other. They froze everything. I can't access anything. This is your fault. There was a pause. Then, you should get a lawyer. The line went dead. She stared at the phone, disbelief turning to something darker. Anger, yes, but underneath it, fear. Not the sharp kind, the slow, sinking realization that no one was coming to fix this. In the conference room, a junior associate slid a document across the table. Ethan skimmed it, pen tapping once, twice. This needs tightening, he said quietly. Language matters. The associate nodded, already making notes. They all understood that. Language was where battles were won, before anyone noticed there had been a fight. By mid-morning, the story had begun to leak not through headlines but whispers. A delayed flight, an incident in first class, a name mentioned in the wrong context. Phones buzzed in pockets. People glanced up from screens, recalibrating. The woman walked the city aimlessly, coat pulled tight against the cold. She passed shop windows filled with things she could no longer buy, reflections she no longer recognized. Every face felt like a witness, every glance a judgment. She avoided mirrors. She ducked into a cafe, ordered coffee, then watched the barista frown apologetically. Sorry, he said. The card didn't go through. Her cheeks burned. She muttered something about cash and left without the drink. At the firm, Ethan stood by the window, watching the river move indifferent and relentless. He remembered a conversation from years ago, a mentor's voice, steady and unsympathetic. Power isn't loud. It's patient. It waits. A knock on the door pulled him back. They're ready for you, someone said. The meeting was brief. Final confirmations. A collective understanding that this was no longer hypothetical. When it ended, Ethan walked out alone. Steps measured, expression unreadable. The woman found herself back at the apartment, sitting on the edge of the bed. She replayed the flight again, slower this time, looking for a different ending. If she had laughed it off, if she had apologized, if she had stayed quiet. The ifs piled up, useless. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. A single sentence. "You've been served." She felt the air leave her lungs. In a quiet hallway, miles away, Ethan signed his name at the bottom of a document. The pen moved smoothly, practiced. He handed it back without comment. Another step completed. Another door closed. The city outside shifted gears as afternoon settled in. Traffic thickened. Clouds lowered. Somewhere a television played a muted news segment, the anchor's voice calm as she read from a teleprompter. No names yet. Just context. Just enough. The woman sat motionless. Papers spread before her like a foreign language. Legal terms blurred together. She searched for something familiar, something she could grasp and bend. There was nothing. Late in the day, Ethan returned to his office. He removed his jacket, hung it carefully, and finally allowed himself to sit. He thought of the older man on the plane, the quiet courage it had taken to speak. He thought of how rarely that happened, how often silence did the real damage. He typed a brief note, sent it, then closed the laptop. Outside, the lights along the river flickered on one by one, reflections stretching and breaking on the surface. Across the city, the woman lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The noise of traffic seeped in through a cracked window. She felt smaller than she ever had, stripped not just of comfort, but of certainty. For the first time, she wondered how many moments like hers had passed unnoticed, unrecorded, unchallenged. Ethan stood and turned off the light. Tomorrow would bring the public part, the part with names and faces and reactions. Today had been about structure, about making sure the ground was solid before anyone stepped forward. As night settled, the city held its breath, unaware that a quiet reckoning had already taken place. One signature, one record, one moment of restraint at a time. The headlines didn't arrive all at once. They crept in cautious, as if testing the ground. A local blurb first, a delayed flight, an on-board incident. Then a name misspelled in one outlet, corrected in another. By noon, the pieces had found each other. By evening, the picture was clear enough for people to decide what they thought it meant. Ethan watched it unfold from a distance, not from screens, but from rooms where the temperature was always slightly too cold, and the chairs were designed to keep you upright. He moved between meetings with the same controlled pace, listening more than he spoke, letting others expose their assumptions. When his name appeared, it did so quietly, nested inside paragraphs, dense with legal language. He preferred it that way. Across town, the woman felt the noise before she saw it. Her phone vibrated without stopping. Friends who hadn't called in years suddenly wanted context. A cousin sent a link with a single word. "Is this you?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Each notification felt like a hand closing around her throat. She turned the television on, then off, turned it on again. Her image flashed briefly on the screen, grainy footage from the jet bridge hair, out of place, eyes wide. The anchor's voice was neutral, almost gentle. The facts were not. She sat on the floor, back against the couch, and laughed once, a thin, broken sound. "This isn't real," she said to the empty room. But the room did not argue. Ethan sat across from a panel that afternoon, a semicircle of faces trained to look skeptical by default. Questions came measured polite, designed to test not what he knew, but how he reacted. He answered each one with precision, never defensive, never expansive. When a question tried to corner him, he let it hang, allowed the silence to do the work. One of the panelists leaned back, folding his arms. "Do you think this has become bigger than necessary?" Ethan considered him for a moment. "I think it became bigger the moment people decided the rules were optional," he said. "Not a rebuke, a statement of record." Outside the city buzzed with opinion. Radio hosts argued about civility and class. Comment sections split into camps, each convinced of its own clarity. Some called it overreach. Others called it overdue. Very few talked about the man who had spoken up on the plane or the attendant who had written everything down. The woman tried to leave the apartment once. She made it to the stairwell before her courage dissolved. The sound of voices below felt too sharp. She imagined faces turning, phones lifting. She went back inside, locked the door, slid down until she was sitting again. She called her husband. It rang longer this time. When he answered, his voice was tight. "You shouldn't be talking to anyone." "I'm not," she said. "I'm talking to you." There was a pause. "My attorneys will handle it," he said. "What about me?" she asked. Another pause. "Longer. You need to understand the position I'm in." The line went dead. Ethan left the building as dusk settled the sky low and colorless. He walked instead of taking a car, letting the cold bite his cheeks awake. He passed cafes and pubs where conversations overlapped, laughter spilling out into the street. Ordinary life unbothered. He liked that. It meant the world hadn't tilted too far. His phone buzzed, a message from an unfamiliar number. "Thank you for saying something." He did not reply. Gratitude was not the point. At a corner, he stopped watching the light change. He thought of the woman's face in the cabin, the moment when certainty curdled into fear. He felt no satisfaction in it, only a quiet resolve that moments like that should never be allowed to pass without consequence. The woman's lawyer arrived late, suit rumpled, eyes tired. He spoke gently, explaining options, timelines, probabilities. His words slid past her. She fixated on one phrase. Pending review. It sounded like a sentence without an end. "What happens next?" she asked. He hesitated. "That depends on what comes out." She stared at him. Out of where? He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was careful. "The records." She understood then in a way she hadn't on the plane. This wasn't contained. It wasn't about a spill or a shout. It was about everything that followed when someone decided to look closely. Ethan returned to his hotel room and stood at the window watching the city glow. His reflection hovered in the glass, superimposed over lights and movement. He thought of the older man on the plane, of the way truth had sounded when spoken plainly. He thought of how rare that was, how expensive silence could be. He poured a glass of water and drank it slowly. Tomorrow would be public in a way today had not. Tomorrow would demand statements and faces and explanations. He would give only what was necessary. On the television, muted, a commentator gestured emphatically, words scrolling beneath him. The woman's name appeared again, flanked by descriptors she did not recognize as herself. She turned the volume up, then down, then off entirely. She went to the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back seemed older, smaller. The confidence she had worn so easily felt like a costume she could no longer find. She pressed her palms to the sink and leaned forward, breathing through her nose, counting. 1, 2, 3. The way therapists taught you when things threatened to spiral. Outside, sirens wailed briefly, then faded. The city did not pause. Ethan set his alarm and turned off the lights. As he lay in the dark, he replayed the sequence one last time, not with doubt, but with clarity. Every step had followed the one before it. Every choice had narrowed the path until there was only one direction left. In another part of the city, the woman lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the buildings settle around her. She thought of the flight, of how quickly a moment had become a story. A story had become a reckoning. She wondered not for the first time how many times she had been spared consequence, simply because no one had bothered to speak. The night stretched on, holding both truths at once. One man, steady and deliberate, moving forward without fanfare. One woman suspended between who she had been and what the world now insisted she face. And somewhere between them, a record existed, indelible, waiting for morning to decide how loudly it would speak. The courthouse steps were slick with rain, stone darkened by decades of weather and consequence. People moved up and down them with practiced indifference, collars turned, briefcases tight to their sides. Ethan arrived early, as he always did, and stood for a moment beneath the overhang, listening to the city breathe. This was where stories slowed down, where emotion gave way to record. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and polish. The corridor hummed with low voices, shoes whispering against marble. Ethan checked in, nodded to a clerk he had met once before, and took a seat on a hard wooden bench. He opened a slim folder, read a single page, closed it again. Everything that mattered was already filed. Down the hall, the woman arrived, flanked by her attorney, shoulders hunched inside a coat that looked heavier than it should have been. Her hair was pulled back, too tight a concession to seriousness she didn't feel. She scanned the room as if searching for an exit that wasn't there. When she saw Ethan seated and composed, something flickered across her face. Not hatred, recognition. Her attorney murmured something, a reminder to breathe, to keep answers short. She nodded without hearing him. They were called in together. The courtroom was smaller than she expected. No grand drama. Just a judge, a clerk, a court reporter setting up her machine with careful clicks. The flag stood in the corner, unmoving. The judge entered. Everyone rose. The woman's knees trembled as she stood, a small betrayal from a body that had always obeyed. When they sat, she kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, nails biting into skin. The proceedings moved quickly. Names entered the record. Jurisdiction confirmed. The judge's voice was steady, neutral, uninvested in anyone's comfort. When Ethan spoke, it was only to clarify facts, dates, times, documentation. He did not look at the woman. He did not need to. Her turn came. She stood, throat dry, heart hammering. Her attorney guided her through a statement careful and sanitized. Words like regret and misunderstanding floated into the room light as dust. She avoided Ethan's gaze until the judge asked a simple question. "Did you consume alcohol after being instructed not to?" The woman swallowed. "Yes." "Did you make physical contact with the other passenger?" Her voice wavered. "Yes." The judge nodded, making a note. There was no gavel slam, no raised voices. just the sound of keys tapping facts being anchored in place. Outside, the rain eased. A thin light broke through the clouds, pale and temporary. The hearing concluded with instructions and timelines. A schedule set. A warning issued. The weight of it settled not all at once, but enough. In the hallway, the woman leaned against the wall, eyes closed. Her attorney spoke quietly into his phone, arranging next steps. She watched Ethan walk past, unhurried, his presence calm as a metronome. Impulse flared. She stepped forward. "Wait," she said. Ethan stopped. She searched for the right words, finding none that would do what she wanted. "I didn't think," she said finally. "I didn't think it would go this far." Ethan met her gaze, not unkind, not soft. "It always does," he said. She looked down at her hands. "What do you want?" The question hung between them, heavy with assumption. Ethan considered it, then shook his head. "This isn't about what I want." He turned and walked away. Outside, cameras waited at a respectful distance, lenses pointed but not aggressive. Ethan bypassed them without comment. He stepped into the street, the city folding around him like a familiar coat. Across town, Richard sat in a conference room that felt suddenly too large. Screens glowed with numbers he no longer controlled. Advisors spoke in careful tones, outlining contingencies. He nodded when expected mind elsewhere. He had watched the hearing on a delayed feed, recognized his wife's posture, the way she had folded inward. He felt a surge of something like guilt, then buried it beneath strategy. There would be time to feel later. The woman returned to the apartment alone. She placed her coat on the chair, slower now, movements cautious. She sat at the table and stared at the blank wall. The silence pressed in. No television, no phone. Just the sound of her own breathing. She thought of the man across the aisle on the plane, the way he had spoken when he did speak, the way the room had shifted when someone else had told the truth. She wondered how many rooms had shifted without her noticing. Ethan spent the afternoon in meetings that felt routine, even as the implications rippled outward. Files were reviewed, recommendations made. He kept his voice level, his comments precise. When the workday ended, he walked again, letting the city carry him. At a small park near the river, he stopped. Children ran past, laughter sharp and unburdened. An older couple sat on a bench, sharing a newspaper, shoulders touching. Ordinary scenes. Anchors. His phone buzzed. A message from the older man on the plane, forwarded through an intermediary. "I testified. Hope it helps." Ethan typed a brief reply. "It matters. Thank you." As dusk settled, the city softened. Lights blinked on. Reflections trembled in the water. Ethan felt the familiar pull to keep moving, to stay ahead of the echo. He resisted it just for a moment. In the apartment, the woman finally picked up her phone. She scrolled past messages she couldn't answer and stopped on one draft unsent. An apology she had written and erased a dozen times. She stared at the cursor, blinking patient and unforgiving. She did not send it. Night fell. The city did what cities do, absorbing one more story into its layers. Somewhere records were updated. Somewhere else, a decision hardened. Ethan turned toward home, knowing tomorrow would bring another chapter, quieter perhaps, but no less final in its way. The first bank notification arrived at dawn, silent and precise, the kind designed not to startle, but to inform. The woman stared at it from the edge of the bed, the screen lighting her face a pale blue. Account access limited. Review pending. She read it twice, then again, as if the words might soften. They did not. Across the city, Ethan was already awake, dressed, reviewing a memo he did not need to read to know its contents. He stood by the window of his apartment, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the river push through the early fog. The city looked calm from above. It always did. Calm was a surface condition. She spent the morning calling numbers that led to voicemails that led to assistants trained to say nothing without saying no. Each call ended the same way, with her thanking someone who had not helped and setting the phone down more carefully than before. The room felt smaller with every attempt. By mid-morning, the news had moved on, not away from her, but past her. The story had been folded into broader conversations about conduct accountability, decorum. Her name appeared less frequently, replaced by abstractions. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt erased, as if the world had already decided she was no longer worth the trouble of attention. Ethan sat through a hearing that morning, where nothing surprising happened. The chair asked questions. The answers were given. The record grew thicker. He noticed how often people spoke around the issue, how rarely they spoke to it. When it ended, he packed his notes and left without comment. She walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside. The street below moved as usual. People crossed with purpose. A delivery truck idled, then moved on. She watched a woman about her age laugh into a phone, free and unburdened. The sight hit her harder than any headline. At noon, a courier arrived with a slim envelope. She signed for it with a hand that trembled only slightly. Inside were documents she could not fully understand, heavy with language that closed doors. She sat at the table and spread them out, aligning corners, trying to impose order. The pages resisted. Ethan met with a colleague for lunch, a quiet place where no one lingered. They spoke in shorthand, efficient, confirming what had already been decided elsewhere. When the check came, Ethan paid without comment. He always did. It was easier that way. The woman's phone rang in the afternoon. A number she recognized. Her husband. She hesitated, then answered. His voice was measured, practiced. He spoke of optics and timelines of what could be salvaged. He did not speak of her. "I need help," she said, finally. There was a pause. "You need representation," he replied. "I need you." Another pause, longer this time. "I can't be the one," he said. "Not now." The line went quiet. She set the phone down and did not pick it up again. Ethan returned home as the light shifted, the city turning amber and then grey. He placed his keys on the counter jacket on the chair and stood for a moment still. He felt the fatigue, then not physical but the deeper kind that followed sustained restraint. He allowed it to pass. She opened a drawer she had avoided and took out a small box. Inside were photographs, old and soft at the edges. Weddings, dinners, smiles captured before they hardened into habits. She flipped through them slowly, stopping on one where she was laughing, head thrown back, unaware of who she would become. She closed the box and pushed it back. At dinner time, Ethan ate simply, standing by the counter, eyes unfocused. He thought of the man on the plane, of how easily a single voice had shifted the room. He wondered how many rooms had never shifted, because no one had spoken. She sat at the table with an empty plate appetite gone. The apartment hummed with the quiet of other lives beyond its walls. She felt the urge to apologize rise again, strong and insistent. She picked up her phone, opened the draft, reread the words she had written. They sounded thin, insufficient. She deleted them. Night settled. Rain began again, light at first, then steadier. Ethan stepped out onto the balcony, letting the damp air cool his skin. Somewhere below, laughter echoed brief and bright. He closed his eyes and listened. She lay on the bed fully dressed, staring at the ceiling. The day replayed itself without her permission. The hearing, the hallway. His voice calm and unyielding. She felt anger flare, then collapse into something like grief. Not for what she had lost, but for what she had never bothered to see. Ethan checked his phone one last time before setting it aside. No new messages, no alarms. The quiet felt earned. He turned off the light and let the darkness take the edges of the room. In the apartment across the city, the woman finally slept, exhaustion dragging her under. Her dreams were restless, filled with corridors and doors that would not open. When she woke briefly, heart racing, she could not remember why. Morning would come. It always did. And with it, the next accounting. The final notice arrived quietly without ceremony, folded into an ordinary morning like any other. The woman read it, standing at the kitchen counter, sunlight cutting across the page, in a way that made the ink look harsher than it was. The language was formal, restrained, impossible to argue with. Proceedings concluded. Conditions set. Consequences assigned. Nothing dramatic. Nothing negotiable. She sat down slowly, the chair scraping against the tile louder than it should have been. Outside, a delivery truck idled, then pulled away. Life continued with an indifference that felt personal. She pressed the paper flat with her palm, as if smoothing it might soften what it said. It did not. Across the city, Ethan watched the same light reach the river, turning the water into a sheet of dull silver. He stood at the window, longer than usual, hands at his sides, jacket still hanging where he had left it the night before. There were no messages waiting, no calls. The work for now was done. She packed a single suitcase that afternoon, not out of necessity, but out of instinct. The apartment felt temporary now, like a place borrowed too long. She folded clothes carefully, choosing practical things, leaving behind anything that reminded her of who she used to be. Jewelry stayed in drawers, dresses stayed on hangers. She closed the suitcase and did not reopen it. Ethan walked to his office for the last meeting of the week. It was brief, efficient. When it ended, a colleague clapped him once on the shoulder, a gesture that carried respect without familiarity. Ethan nodded and moved on. He did not linger. They crossed paths one last time, by accident, not design. A narrow sidewalk near the river late afternoon, the city softened by distance and drizzle. She recognized him first, slowing as if the air itself had thickened. He saw her a moment later and stopped not out of obligation but acknowledgement. They stood there, two people, bound by a moment neither could undo. She looked thinner, smaller. He looked the same. That somehow unsettled her most. "I'm leaving," she said. Her voice was steady. It surprised her. Ethan nodded once. "That's probably wise." She waited for something else. A lecture, a condemnation. It did not come. The silence stretched not uncomfortable, just complete. "I didn't see you," she said finally. "Not really." Ethan considered her words. "Most people don't," he said. "Until they have to." She nodded, eyes on the pavement. "I'm sorry," she said. The words landed softly without expectation. Ethan met her gaze. He did not smile. He did not harden. "I know," he said. That was all. He stepped aside, allowing her to pass. She walked on, without looking back, the sound of her footsteps fading into the city's noise. Ethan continued toward the river, hands in his pockets, now shoulders lighter than they had been in weeks. He thought of the older man on the plane of the attendant, who had written everything down, of how rarely small acts were given their due. He thought of how easily power disguised itself as normalcy, and how fragile that disguise really was. The evening settled in layers. Lights flickered on. Reflections broke and reformed with the movement of water. Ethan stopped at the railing and leaned forward, breathing in the damp air. Somewhere behind him, laughter rose and fell. Somewhere else, a door closed for good. She boarded a train at dusk, suitcase at her feet, hands folded in her lap. The window reflected her face back at her older, now more honest. As the train pulled away, she watched the city recede. Not with bitterness, but with something like clarity. The world had not singled her out. It had simply stopped looking away. Ethan returned home as night took hold. He placed his keys where they always went, poured a glass of water, and sat down. For the first time since the flight, he allowed himself to be still without anticipation. The quiet felt earned. Tomorrow would bring another case, another set of names, another room where assumptions would be tested. That was the work. It never ended. But tonight the ledger was balanced. Somewhere between departure and arrival, a lesson had settled into place. Not shouted, not forced. Just written down, recorded, and allowed to stand. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below with 3 simple words: justice still matters.